This story happened to me during my freshman year of college in 2020. Now that I've graduated, I still often think about it every Halloween. My college was always buzzing with parties, especially in the Big Ten system, where frat houses and bars required everyone to dress up. It was pretty wild. Tons of alcohol, tons of cops, and tons of memories. The event I'm talking about happened on a Saturday night during Halloween week. Our football team had just won a big game, and my friends and I decided to head to an off-campus frat party to celebrate. We knew about the party because my friend, Alexandro, was dating someone on the football team. We got to the frat house around 11 p.m., and things were already crazy. Everyone was drinking heavily and getting drunk fast. We were all chanting and making fun of the school we had just beaten, with music blasting in the background. I took a few shots and danced with my friends, having a great time. A crucial detail to note is that my phone had died at this point. I gave it to Alexandro to keep in her purse. Later, I told my friends I needed to go to the bathroom and asked them to wait for me near the DJ booth. By this time, we were all pretty tipsy. While I was in the bathroom, I suddenly heard one of the frat brothers scream, "Cops!" and immediately everyone started panicking and bolting out of the house. I ran outside and saw flashing lights from multiple police cars. People were running in all directions. Some of the cops were talking to the frat brothers, while others were trying to catch underage drinkers. In my drunken state, I realized I didn't have my phone and started shouting for my friends while trying to avoid the cops. But I quickly understood that I wouldn't be able to find them in the chaos. I decided to head back to the dorms on my own, even though I wasn't entirely sure of the way. The frat house was far from campus, in a different area than most of the other frats. I began my walk back, and it was freezing cold. Even though it was just October, the temperature had dropped to around 37 degrees Fahrenheit. I was still pretty drunk, but aware enough to take in my surroundings. After walking for a while, I knew I needed to take a break to warm up and hopefully sober up a bit. I spotted a building that looked like one of the academic buildings I had heard of. So I walked up to it, opened the door, and stepped inside. It was pretty dark inside, but the exit signs near the doors provided enough light to see a bit of the space. After about 5 minutes, I started to sober up a bit more and realized I wasn't in an academic building. I was in a warehouse. I was warmer, but the eerie feeling in the air started to make me nervous. I walked back to the door, only to find my stomach drop. The door was locked. How had it opened if it was locked from the inside? I began walking toward another door near the exit sign, pushed it open, and walked through, thinking it would lead me outside. Instead, it led to another part of the building. This room was much smaller, lit by a faint red light. There was a buzzing noise coming from some kind of machine in the room. I'm not kidding, it felt like I had walked into a scene from a horror movie. I turned around to try to go back through the door, but it was locked behind me. Panic set in, and I tried my best not to break down. I leaned against the wall and slid down, crying silently. That's when I heard it. A door slamming shut, followed by footsteps. I instantly went quiet, my eyes wide open. Another door slammed shut and more footsteps followed. They were getting closer. I saw a door next to me, opened it as quietly as I could, and slipped through. I started moving through hanging chains and steam. I heard the door from the previous room open, and the footsteps got closer. They were heavy footsteps. My fight or flight instinct kicked in, and I spotted a window. Using all my strength, I kicked the window 5 times, shattering it. Right then, I heard footsteps running toward the door. I had maybe 10 seconds. I jumped out the window, as in that the other side of the building had a pretty high drop. I fell about 10 feet and landed on top of 2 recycling bins. I pushed myself off, dazed from the fall, and looked up at the window. It was shattered, but no one was in the frame. I dashed toward some pine trees a few feet away, hiding in the shadows. When I looked back, I saw a figure standing at the window, scanning the area, searching for me. My entire body went numb with fear. As quietly as I could, I crossed the street and started running. I ran for my life, not sure how long, until I recognized the campus area near my dorm. When I finally got back, my friends were outside waiting for me, panicking and worried. They told me I had been gone for nearly 4 hours. The next day I told them what had happened. Their jaws dropped as they listened to my story. After talking it over, we realized that the building I had been in had been abandoned for years. That sinking feeling hit me again. Whoever was in that building wasn't a cop or security. It was some random person who was after me. To this day, just thinking about it makes me feel sick. If I hadn't been as quiet or as quick thinking, I might not have made it out alive. Even though I tried to find out more information, nothing ever came up. It still remains the scariest thing that has ever happened to me. This is a fresh story that happened not too long ago. My family and I were driving to my college to help me move into my dorm since I'm a first-year student. When we arrived, I found out that I'd be living in a Jack and Jill style room, which means that my room and another share the same bathroom. So basically, I'd be living with 3 other guys. I already knew one of them because we met during orientation and got to know each other. His roommate isn't important for this story though. The one I want to talk about is my roommate, Diora. Before moving in, I had already connected with Diora through social media, and we exchanged information before the move. I tried messaging him on Instagram to get to know him better, but his responses were really dry. Plus, his profile looked like one of those Discord mod types you see in Instagram Reels or TikToks. When we finally moved in, I met Diora in person, and ironically, he looked exactly like a Discord mod, except he had a skinny build and was about the same height as me. He looked pale and had a bit of thin facial hair. I tried talking to him again, but his conversation style matched his texting. Very reserved. He stuttered a lot and always seemed eager to end the conversation as quickly as possible. I tried to loosen things up by asking what kind of music he liked, but he said he doesn't listen to music because it doesn't fill the emptiness inside him. Things got even weirder when he set up his PS5 and immediately started gaming. It wasn't the fact that he gamed that was strange. It was how he acted while gaming. Diora would make these weird grunting noises, shake his body violently, and laugh out loud while spamming the controller. He'd put his feet inside his desk cabinet and occasionally pull his feet toward his body as he shook. He would whisper to himself while playing, whether solo or with his online friends, and he often repeated what he whispered twice, adding a creepy giggle. Diora stayed in the room 24/7 and almost never did any homework. Just watching his strange movements made it hard for me to sleep, but there was more weirdness to come. During the first week, I went out with some new friends I'd met in my dorm building, and I got back to my room pretty late, around 1 a.m. Diora seemed to be asleep in his bed, so I didn't think much of it. As I opened my cabinet, which was right next to my bed, I suddenly got goosebumps and felt this weird urge to turn around. When I did, I saw Diora staring straight at me with a slight grin on his face. I yelped and said, "Jesus, Diora, why are you looking at me like that?" He chuckled and replied, "Dark times," then turned to face the wall. This creeped me out, and it happened 3 more times after that. I tried to switch rooms, but the school told me there were no other available dorms. I even tried moving into the other room, but one of the guys there didn't want to leave, so I was stuck with Diora for the rest of the semester. After about 3 months, I came back to the dorm after my English class. When I opened the door, Diora jumped up in a panic and asked why I was back so early. This was odd because my English class actually ended late, which is why I was returning later than usual. I asked him if he needed the room to himself, but he declined and struck some weird pose that looked like it was straight out of an anime. He said I shouldn't worry at all. His whole attitude made me feel even more uncomfortable. I noticed a box on his desk, so I asked him about it. He said it wasn't important. I didn't think much of it at first, but I soon realized that my iPhone charger and scissors were missing. I asked Diora if he'd seen them, and he admitted that he had them. He handed me the scissors, and as he gave me my charger, the cable knocked over the box, sending it tumbling toward me. When the box opened, my heart sank. A sticky note with my name on it fell out, along with a transparent case. Inside the case were eyelashes, a pair of glasses, a pair of my socks, and a disposable photo of me that I had taken as a joke. Diora scrambled to pick everything up and tried to explain what it all meant, but I yelled at him to get out. He left immediately. I texted the resident assistant, RA, about what had happened, and he told me that he wasn't around at the moment. But when he got back the next day, I should show him the box as evidence so they could have a reason to kick Diora out. So I grabbed the box and hid it in my laundry bin. I felt shaken up and disgusted by the thought of my roommate. About an hour later, Diora came back. I just told him to stay on his side of the room and not to talk to me. After that, no more words were exchanged. I tried to stay awake, fearing that he might try to find the box, but after such a long day, I fell asleep around 2 a.m. When I woke up the next morning, Diora was gone, and I felt a sense of relief. But then I remembered the box. I rushed to check my laundry bin, and it was gone. Panic set in, and shortly after, the RA knocked on the door. I let him in and told him everything. Although he believed me, he said there was nothing he could do without the box as evidence, since otherwise it would just be my word against Diora's. I felt like I was losing my mind. The RA left, and about 5 hours later, Diora returned. I asked him what he did with the box, but he played dumb and said, "What box? I don't know what you're talking about." I pressed him to stop acting clueless, but he kept denying it. I couldn't stand being around him anymore, or even looking at him. Now it's the second semester, and unfortunately, I'm still rooming with Diora. He did promise that he would never do anything like that again, and said that if it happened, he'd let me know, and we'd move out immediately. I reluctantly took his word for it, and here we are, still sharing a room. But I try to stay out of the room as much as I can. He still creeps me out. The worst part is that some nights I can't sleep, and during the day I struggle to focus because I keep thinking about what was in that box. Why did he steal my photo? Why did he take my socks? What were the glasses for? The part that scares me the most whenever I think about it is the eyelashes in that box. And perhaps the strangest thing of all, he labeled the box with my name. My name is Mark, and I graduated from the University of California, Berkeley in 2016. My college experience was truly fantastic. I joined a fraternity, managed my studies well, and spent just the right amount of time chasing after girls. Even now, I still keep in close touch with many of my fraternity brothers, and I recently got engaged to Rosie, whom I also met at Berkeley. However, if you had asked me what I thought about Berkeley when I was a freshman, I can guarantee my answer would have been very, very different. What I'm about to share is one of the main reasons I wasn't overly ambitious in high school. The atmosphere at Berkeley felt unfamiliar to me, and it was strange being surrounded by people who constantly proclaimed themselves as top achievers. As a freshman, I quickly got swept up in the whirlwind of career development, mapping out the next 30 years of my life at just 18 years old. Sounds crazy, I know, but that was the reality of the school at the time. If you wanted any chance of breaking into the business world, having a strong LinkedIn profile was an absolute must. I still vividly remember the stress of trying to craft a professional image online, as if my future depended on the connections I made and the skills I listed. Anyway, I checked off all the boxes and started looking for a summer internship. It wasn't long before my inbox chimed with a genuinely exciting message. To my surprise, a well-known business firm reached out to me, expressing interest in my profile. It wasn't one of those bot messages either. The content showed that it was a uniquely tailored message just for me. I must have read the message 6 times before I responded, and after about a day of brief exchanges, I was invited to a first-round interview. I spent hours researching the company, preparing for what to expect, and getting ready with all the sample questions I could find. Shortly after, I received a message from a man named Armin Slowinski. I'll never forget that name for as long as I live. He said he would be my interviewer, and naturally, the first thing I did was look him up. However, my excitement quickly turned into confusion. I searched LinkedIn for Armin's profile, hoping to learn more about the person I'd soon be meeting. Strangely enough, I found nothing. No professional footprint, no social media presence, nothing. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe he was just a private guy. Armand and I agreed on a day and time, and he gave me the interview location. I looked it up on my phone and realized it was at some random coffee shop in Oakland. That's when I started feeling uneasy. Why wasn't the interview happening in Berkeley? There were tons of coffee shops and great places for interviews right on campus, so I was honestly perplexed. The address looked legit online though, so I didn't think too much about it. The day before the interview, I told my friend Riley about the situation. He was even more confused than I was, saying the whole thing seemed sketchy. I agreed with him, but I figured the opportunity was worth the risk. He asked how I planned to get there, and I told him I'd take an Uber. He offered to drive me since he wasn't doing anything at the time. I thanked him and accepted his offer. Little did I know, I might not even be telling this story if he hadn't offered to drive me. At 4 p.m. the next day, Riley picked me up at my dorm. Admittedly, I was super nervous. This was one of my first real interviews. I got in the car, and we were off. About 20 minutes later, I asked Riley to drop me off down the street because I didn't want to be seen getting dropped off by a friend before an interview. I thanked him, and he offered to wait for me. I asked if he was sure, and he smirked, pulling out a big bag of weed from his dashboard. I laughed, and then shut the car door. I walked for a few minutes to the location and froze. In front of me was a literal construction site. There was no coffee shop. Even weirder, this entire area wasn't residential at all. Every building looked either closed or private. I was confused. I double-checked my phone and confirmed I was at the right address. It seemed like the whole block had just been demolished, so recently in fact, that Google Maps hadn't even updated yet. I pulled out my phone to call Riley, but before I could, a booming voice called out behind me. "Mark," a deep voice echoed. I turned around and saw an absurdly tall man wearing a very expensive-looking black suit. Thank God, I thought, relieved that this wasn't some sort of setup. His presence was commanding, yet strangely out of place amid the desolate surroundings. I should also mention that he was standing next to a matte black Bentley. He walked toward me with a puzzled look on his face. We shook hands, and when I asked him about the construction site, he said he was just as surprised as I was. He furrowed his brows and placed his hand on his chin. "You know what? Why don't we find someplace else? Get in," he said, motioning toward the Bentley. He walked back to the car and shouted over his shoulder, "Shotguns, all yours." Without saying another word, he hopped in the driver's seat and closed the door. Excited, I followed. I walked around the car to admire it for a second and couldn't help but glance into the back seat. I expected to see the luxurious leather seats you'd normally find in a Bentley, but instead, my eyes met a sight that made my blood run cold. Lying flat on the floor, hidden in the shadows, was a man. In his hand, he was holding something long and metallic. Panic shot through me, and my mind raced with the realization of what I was witnessing. This was a trap. I turned away from the car and ran as fast as I could. I heard the man call my name from behind, but I didn't even look back. As I ran, I heard the one sound I had feared the most, screeching tires. I glanced over my shoulder and saw the car turning around, aiming straight at me. I had to think fast. There was no way I could outrun a car. It wasn't like there was anywhere obvious to escape to, just a maze of city streets. I could feel the terror coursing through me. When I reached the next intersection, I had to make a split-second decision that could determine my fate, left or right. Logic told me to turn left as it was closer, but my feet chose for me before my brain could. I sprinted across the street to the right and bolted down the road. I knew I had only about 10 or 20 seconds at most. As if by divine intervention, one of the buildings ahead had a fire escape just low enough for me to reach. With all the strength I could muster, I leaped up and grabbed onto the ladder. I had never done a pull-up in my life, but at that moment, I knew it was a matter of life or death. I pulled myself up and continued climbing. The Bentley screeched around the corner and stopped in front of the building. I couldn't see the driver, but I knew he was watching me. There was nothing else I could do. If they chose to follow, I'd have to fight. That next minute felt like an eternity. The car sat there a little while longer, then sped off down the street, turning left and disappearing from sight. I couldn't breathe. I pulled out my phone and called Riley, practically screaming into the phone about what had just happened. I stayed on the fire escape until he found me. I got into his car, and we sped off in silence. The aftermath of the whole thing was relatively uneventful. I mostly pushed it out of my mind and refused to talk about it, even with Riley. As far as I was concerned, it never happened. But no matter how hard I tried, there are still moments, like right now, when I can't help but recall every horrifying detail of what could have been the last day of my life. Before we dive into the next story, if you're here for the first time, let me know where you're tuning in from. Be sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss any of the upcoming scary stories. We appreciate your support. Feel free to share these stories with your friends and family. Thank you. It's been 9 years since I graduated from college. I went to Cooper Union, a small technical school located right in the heart of Manhattan. Going to school in New York City was incredible, and I've never regretted it. Back then, we didn't have many fraternities, so I made sure to join anyone I could, just to have the opportunity to attend parties and be involved in social activities. I was a pretty average kid, so getting an invite to join wasn't too difficult. Most of the initiation events were fairly mild, but I quickly realized that they were just a warm-up for the tougher challenges to come. I hope telling this story won't get me into trouble, but since it happened so long ago, I think it's safe to share now. I don't know if my old frat still carries out this tradition, and I sincerely hope they've stopped. Anyway, the biggest event we faced during initiation was an exploration of the subway tunnels. I don't remember the exact location, but there was an abandoned subway station that young people often explored. Our frat would take us down from an active platform, walk to the abandoned one, take a few pictures, and then continue on to the next active station. We were given subway schedules to ensure that no trains would come through while we were vulnerable. We had enough time to reach the abandoned station, wait for a train to pass, and then move on to the next stop. You're probably thinking we had to run from trains, but no, the plan was carefully organized and we had plenty of time to navigate the tracks safely. All we had to do was avoid the dangerous third rail, and we'd be fine. I had always been a fan of urban exploration even before college, so this experience excited me more than it worried me. On some random weeknight, around 3 a.m., the fraternity brothers told us to head down into the subway. I assumed they chose this time because trains ran infrequently and we'd be safe. There were about 10 of us in the group. Our school was small, so there's no need to name everyone, but my best friend in the pledge class was an Albanian guy named Riker. He was the funniest person you'd ever meet. Our friends always joked that Riker should try stand-up comedy. He also smoked a lot of weed, which is a key part of this story. The entire group made it into the subway without any problems. Riker and I took the rear because everyone else was too scared to be at the back. It was pitch black down there, and the frat brothers only gave us 2 flashlights to share. Those flashlights and a cheap film camera were all we had. Initially, I was holding one of the flashlights since I was at the back, but I quickly gave it to another pledge who was complaining about not being able to see. We hadn't been walking for more than 30 seconds before Riker had his brilliant idea. He pulled out a pre-rolled joint from his jacket and grinned mischievously, motioning for me to stop. "I don't have enough to share with everyone," he whispered, nodding toward the rest of the group, who hadn't noticed what we were doing. Despite my better judgment, I agreed. After all, when else would I get the chance to smoke weed in a subway tunnel? The 2 of us lit up while we watched the rest of the group move further away, their echoing laughter gradually fading into the distance. After we finished, we found ourselves pretty far behind the group. Riker's weed was strong, and I found myself feeling more out of it than I'd expected. My tolerance wasn't as high as his, clearly. We hurried to catch up with the others, but then Riker noticed something on the path ahead. Without a light, we could only make out the silhouette of a figure standing under the dim tunnel lights. I squinted, trying to see more clearly. Sure enough, there was someone standing motionless in the middle of the tracks, facing us. It was eerie. "David?" Riker called out, breaking the tunnel's silence. The figure didn't respond. Just then, We heard David's voice call back to us from further up ahead. Both of us froze. This figure was a stranger. As if David's voice had triggered something, the person on the tracks suddenly started sprinting toward us at full speed. We both turned and ran in the opposite direction. Being high, I felt like I was on the verge of a panic attack. The figure's footsteps were strangely quiet, almost like we were being chased by a shadow. The person moved with an unnerving lightness. Riker gripped my arm tightly, his usual cocky attitude completely gone. "Faster," he hissed, his voice full of the same fear I felt. I knew we still had time before the next train came, but running in the wrong direction felt wrong. Riker must have felt the same because he suddenly yanked me to the side, motioning for us to cross the divider to another track. Looking back, we probably should have kept running toward the original station, but I was too high to question it and just followed Riker's lead. We crossed the divider and kept running toward the abandoned station. Things got even more nerve-wracking, though. We had no idea when a train might come down this track, but at least I hoped we were headed in the right direction. Riker's move seemed to shake off the person chasing us, but it didn't. The figure also crossed the divider and kept pursuing us. The problem was, there were only a few places where we could cross the divider, so we prayed we'd find another one before a train came. Turning back to the one we just used wasn't an option. My heart was racing, but Riker and I managed to widen the gap between us and whoever was chasing us. We kept running, searching for another crossing point, but no luck. Riker started cursing under his breath, and I felt like I was going to throw up. We kept running, still searching. Then the tracks began to vibrate, and we saw a light coming from the far end of the tunnel. A train was approaching. We were trapped. I considered turning around and fighting whoever was chasing us, but just then, Riker screamed, "Here!" and bolted toward the divider. By some miracle, the next crossing point appeared right in front of us, and we scrambled back to the original track. We sprinted another 30 yards and caught up with the rest of the group, who were waiting on the platform. Riker explained everything while I leaned over and threw up. Not even 30 seconds later, the train roared past on the other track. Riker and the others were ready to confront whoever had been chasing us, but no one showed up. We thought it was over, but suddenly, we heard another crazed scream from somewhere in the distance. To this day, I still don't know how that person managed to avoid the train. We waited for the train to pass on our track, and then bolted out of there as fast as we could. Looking back, Riker and I probably just encountered a homeless person who was high and maybe wasn't even a real threat. But in that moment, the fear completely took over, and I guess that's why we made the stupid decision to cross the divider. We probably could have handled that guy, but I'm glad we didn't have to. This happened to me about a year ago, and that's why I'm writing about it now. I was a 19-year-old college student at the time, going through the process of joining a fraternity on campus. The school I attended was known for its wild parties in the South, and fraternity life was taken very seriously there. For privacy reasons, I won't go into specific details, but that night was the one where I, along with 20 other students, would officially become fraternity brothers. Throughout the several months of joining, the brothers would make us do all sorts of weird things, like blindfolding us and taking us to strange places, typical initiation stuff you hear about. That night was no different. We were blindfolded and left the frat house around 10:30 p.m. They took our phones and drove us to some unknown location, splitting us up into multiple cars to ensure everyone got there. On the way, they made us sing this ridiculous song at full blast. We always had to do these annoying tasks while blindfolded, and I guess it was all part of the initiation. After about 20 minutes of driving, the car stopped, and I heard the doors open and close. Someone grabbed my arm and quietly led me out of the car. We walked about 200 feet before I was told to sit down and stay quiet. I was sitting on grass, so I assumed we were in some kind of field or open area. I could hear others sitting down around me, and the brothers telling everyone to remain silent. After sitting in silence for about a minute, I heard a voice addressing all of us, talking about the values of the fraternity and how we had been chosen to become part of the Brotherhood. Over the next 30 minutes, I sat there, occasionally hearing footsteps and movements around me. I figured they were finishing up the last steps of the initiation with each person, maybe taking them aside individually to speak with them. I wasn't sure, but being blindfolded left everything to my imagination. At some point, the footsteps stopped, and all that remained were the sounds of crickets and leaves rustling in the night breeze. I began to feel uneasy, as I had been sitting there in silence for what felt like 20 minutes. Then, suddenly, I heard footsteps approaching again, and a hand grabbed my wrist, leading me away. The person said nothing, and neither did I. I just wanted to get it over with, so I could take off the stupid blindfold. As we walked, I felt the ground change from soft grass to rougher terrain. I figured we were walking through a forest since I could feel branches and shrubs brushing against me. We walked for a while, and at some point, the blindfold became extremely uncomfortable. I told the person this and asked if we could stop for a moment so I could adjust it. He stopped and let go of me. As I stood there rubbing my eyes under the blindfold, I heard a deep, raspy voice say, "Take it off." I hesitated for a second, not sure what to say. The voice threw me off because it didn't sound like anyone I recognized. Regardless, I slowly took off the blindfold, and what I saw wasn't at all what I had expected. Standing in front of me was a tall man, dressed in all black and wearing a vendetta mask. I let out a sharp scream and jumped back. A part of me thought this was just some messed up prank, but before I could say anything, he lunged at me, shouting that he was going to take me with him. We wrestled on the ground, and I could feel him trying to choke me. With all my strength, I threw him off, got up, and ran in the opposite direction, relying on the faint moonlight to guide me. My heart was pounding, and I kept looking back, terrified that he was chasing me. Finally, I heard someone calling my name, and I nearly ran straight into one of the fraternity brothers. I frantically tried to explain what had happened, telling them that some guy in a mask had led me into the woods and attacked me. But before I could say more, 5 or 6 of them grabbed flashlights and ran into the woods, trying to find him. One of the brothers stayed with me to calm me down and walk me back to safety. When we finally got out of the woods, I realized we were in the backyard of a house, likely one of the brothers. I saw almost the entire fraternity standing on the porch, staring at us in shock. I asked them what the hell had just happened. They explained that because it was so dark and I was the last in line, the brother who was supposed to be guiding me had accidentally left me behind and didn't realize I wasn't with the group. A few minutes later, one of them thought they saw something moving in the woods, and that's when they realized I was missing. I was too shocked to even be angry. Nobody knew who the man was, but some of the brothers speculated that he could have been from a rival fraternity. Not long after, the flashlights emerged from the woods, and I saw the others running back toward us. They told everyone to get out of there immediately and head back to campus. No one asked any questions. They locked up the house, and one of them called the police. On the ride back, I was bombarded with questions, and I did my best to answer, though my mind was still racing. I couldn't stop thinking about who that man was, why he was wearing a mask, and what he was trying to do. I came up with all sorts of scenarios, like maybe he was from a rival fraternity trying to abduct me before I could officially join. But that didn't explain why the brothers locked the house and called the police. I didn't learn the full truth until the next day, when one of the guys who had chased after him told me what they found in the woods. And what they found was beyond anything I could have imagined. While they were running, they spotted a light in the distance. They went silent. As they got closer, they realized it was a bonfire in the middle of a clearing. Surrounding the fire were several people dressed in all black, wearing white vendetta masks. They were chanting and throwing things into the fire. One of the brothers accidentally stepped on a branch, making a loud snap, and all the masked figures turned to face them. The brothers froze, just like something out of a horror movie. Then suddenly, the masked men started running toward them. The brothers fled and made it back, telling everyone to leave and call the police immediately. It seemed like we had stumbled upon some sort of cult ritual. I Couldn't sleep for many nights after that, trying to shake the memory of what had happened. But a few days later, something else happened that sent chills down my spine. While a few brothers were playing football in the backyard of that same house, they found a white vendetta mask hanging from a nearby tree. They called the police, and the mask was taken as evidence for investigation. I don't know if those people were ever caught, or if the police found out anything. I also don't know what they were doing in those woods. I've been thinking about this experience a lot lately, and I'm just glad I made it out with nothing more than a crazy story to tell. My college years were undoubtedly some of the best years of my life. Don't get me wrong, I'm happy with where I am now, but the memories of those 4 years are timeless. My advice to anyone still in college, don't waste a single moment, because it will be gone before you know it. I went to a college that was practically on the beach. Our entire campus seemed to blend seamlessly with the ocean. This story took place during my pledge process with my class. For those who don't know, it's a whole semester of initiation into a fraternity, something everyone who gets a bid has to go through. During that semester, a lot happened, but most of it is better left unsaid. And then came the final week of pledging, right before we were officially going to become brothers. That week is typically when the fraternity ramps up the challenges. For us, it was understood that at some point during that final week, we'd have to face the beach challenge. Here's what would happen. The brothers would drive us about 12 miles down the coast on a Friday night. Then, we'd have an hour to finish an enormous keg filled with who knows what. After that, they would lead us down to the beach, tie all our wrists together, blindfold us, take our phones, watches, and shoes, and leave us there. We had until sunrise to get back to the frat house, or we'd be dropped. Honestly, I was pretty nervous about the whole thing, but there wasn't much I could do. None of us could. That night, I remember it being oddly cold, but the excitement of finally becoming an official brother overshadowed my nerves. The keg part was the easiest. By this point, we were used to splitting up the alcohol and dealing with it if necessary. There were 15 of us. After we were all tied together, the brothers blindfolded everyone except Chandler, who was at the front of the line. He was our guide, and that was the only help we'd get. Our pledge master was this big Mexican dude named Ramirez, but he insisted we call him Los Pollos, like the restaurant from Breaking Bad. He was a strange guy. He went over the rules one last time, joined the rest of the brothers, and left us on our own. I won't list everyone's names, but my closest friends in the pledge class were Chandler, Whitworth, Jackson, and Vikram. I was at the very back of the line, right behind Whitworth. We started walking, following Chandler's lead. The journey was pure hell. Without our phones, we had no way of knowing how far we had gone or how much time we had left. All we could do was keep walking. At first, we tried to keep our spirits up by talking and joking around, but after a while, that got old. After about 2 hours of walking, we were trudging along in complete silence, with occasional stops when someone needed to throw up. I started to zone out. Even the sound of the waves seemed to fade as I got lost in my own thoughts. Everything was silent. Suddenly, I felt a sharp tug on the rope around my wrists, so I took a few big steps forward and stopped, thinking Whitworth had tripped. He was clumsier than most of us, so it wasn't surprising. I didn't have the energy to ask if he was okay, so I just waited. I must have stood there like a statue for a full minute. Something felt off. I was about to say something when the rope around my wrists pulled tight again. I kept walking, relieved that Whitworth hadn't passed out. We resumed our trek, and I drifted back into my spaced-out state, feeling exhausted. I prayed we were close to finishing. We had to be, but just then I noticed something strange. My foot wasn't hitting damp sand anymore. It was stepping into shallow water. I took a few more steps, and the water started rising to my ankles. I was confused. Why was Chandler leading us into the water? The rope pulled tight again, meaning Whitworth and the others ahead of me were still moving, so I followed. I figured maybe someone needed to rinse off their feet. If no one else was complaining, I wasn't about to either. The water stayed around our ankles for a while, rising and falling with the waves. But then the water began to rise again until it comfortably reached my shins. Chandler had to be messing with us, which I couldn't understand. Wasn't this whole ordeal already painful enough? The water was only slowing us down. A few moments later, I started to hear a faint noise in the distance. I strained my ears and recognized the sound. It was a boat engine idling. As we kept walking, the sound got louder, meaning either the boat was coming closer or we were getting closer to it. I was getting really uncomfortable. The water was now nearing my knees. Finally, I couldn't stay silent any longer. "Guys, what the hell are we doing in the water?" I waited, confused as to why no one was answering me. "Guys?" I asked again, this time more panicked. Still nothing. I could feel the panic setting in. Suddenly, my blindness became suffocating. I had to see. I reached up to try to undo my blindfold, but as soon as I did, the rope yanked my arms back down. I cursed under my breath, bent my head down, and managed to undo the blindfold before the rope could pull it away again. To my horror, it wasn't Whitworth leading me. Instead, I found myself staring at a middle-aged man holding the frayed end of the rope tied around my wrists. I stared in shock at the severed rope in his hand, and that's when I saw what had cut it. A long, rusty kitchen knife in his left hand. Behind him was a small boat bobbing in the water, and I could make out 3 other figures standing on it. I screamed bloody murder before the man could react, yanking my arms as hard as I could. At the same time, I lifted one foot out of the water and kicked him in the chest with all my strength. Luckily, the rope slipped out of his grip. He tried to grab my shirt, but it ripped with a loud tear. He yelled as he fell into the water, holding a chunk of my white pledge shirt, but I was already running as fast as I could toward the shore, my wrists still tied. A few seconds later, I heard a splash from behind. Someone had jumped off the boat. I didn't look back, I just kept running. I was halfway to dry land when something flew past my head, inches from my right ear. It was the knife. I watched it disappear into the water. I was in complete shock, but the adrenaline was doing its job. I made it to shore and finally looked back. There were 2 men in the water and 2 still on the boat. They weren't chasing me anymore, just staring at me blankly. The nearest man was still holding the piece of my shirt he had torn off. I didn't waste another second. I ran up the beach to the road. By now, the sun had risen, but the frat was the last thing on my mind. I flagged down the nearest car, and after begging to use their phone, I called the police. It was pointless. By the time the cops showed up, the men were long gone, probably off to wherever in that tiny boat of theirs. I lied to the police about what had happened, worried it might get the frat in trouble. Luckily, they didn't ask too many questions. My brothers weren't too hard on me either. They were more pissed at Chandler for not realizing what had happened, though he swears he didn't hear a thing. After that, I became a brother, and life went back to normal. Well, normal for a while. A few weeks later, some of the guys and I were playing beach games behind the house when Jackson spotted something in the distance. There was a stick poking out of the sand, and tied to it was the white piece of cloth torn from my shirt. The design on the stick was unmistakable. It was my shirt. To this day, I still don't know how those guys knew which frat I was in. My brothers think they recognized the piece of my shirt, but I have a more disturbing theory. I think it's very possible they knew our fraternity would send pledges out to that beach that night, blind and helpless. I think they planned the whole thing around that stupid tradition, ready to kidnap anyone they could. I just happened to be the unlucky one at the back of the line, and that still gives me chills to this day. I can't stop wondering what would have happened if I had gotten on that boat. The police, as usual, were useless. It's been years, and they've found nothing.